Hi, everyone. I'm John Hosky from FedInsider, standing in today for Claudia Hosky, and on behalf of the George Washington University College of Professional Studies, Carasoft, and Axonius Federal, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar on using AI for the heavy lifting in CMMC compliance. Please type any of your questions or comments into the Q&A pod. You're also welcome to join us in the chat. If we don't get to your questions during today's session, we will share them with our speakers so they can follow up with you directly. Also, take note of the resources tab on the left side of your screen. We offer live captioning for all of our shows. To follow along, there's a hyperlink under the live captioning or cart tab located just above the slides. And if you need a copy of the captioning transcript, it'll be available in the resources section in the next day or two. If you want to earn a training credit for today's session, you're going to need to answer all the polling questions and stay online for the duration of today's 60-minute conversation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to my friend and our moderator today, Bill Pratt from FedInsider. Take it away, Bill.
Thank you, John. Hey, everyone. Welcome. CMMC, it's a big topic. Today's conversation is going to intentionally ground in reality. For federal systems integrators, CMMC Level 2 is not just a cyber requirement. It directly affects how work is bid, delivered, governed, and sustained across multiple customer environments. We're going to spend the first part of this discussion focused squarely on CMMC itself, and then we're going to turn over to see how AI becomes necessary to scale and sustain compliance over time. We've got a great panel today. Let me start by introducing them. Jeff Smith is here. He's the CMMC design architect for Red River. Nick Summers is the co-founder of ComplAi. Brian Stretchmeyer is the field CTO of Axonius Federal. And Dr. John Salen is the vice president of the cyber portfolio defense division at GDIT. So let's just jump right into it, everyone. Let's get started with what CMMC really changed. I better be able to say that to get through this conversation. But Jeff, from a federal systems integrator perspective, what makes CMMC Level 2 fundamentally different from previous compliance efforts like NIST 800-171 self-attestation?
Yeah, Bill, thanks, man. So I think the difference is obviously prior to finalization of CMMC, organizations could self-attest, check a box that they're quote unquote complying with NIST 800-171, sign a contract and move on without having to prove anything unless the DoD performed a random check. So now CMMC adds the accountability in the form of evidence, assessments with C3PAOs for observation of CMMC controls, all in an effort to show that this is how your DIB organization has operationalized its cyber maturity and committed to required controls in the NIST 800-171 framework.
There's a difference between achieving initial certification and maintaining that certification, right? Especially when an integrator is managing internal compliance while also delivering compliance services to government customers. How does that change the approach? And Jeff, I think you're on mute, Jeff.
Yeah, gotcha. As I was thinking about this, I thought the approach doesn't really change much at all. I mean, you manage your CMMC environment just like you do for your customers. You use your AI and automation tools, ensure your inventories are accurate, and continue to deliver on operationalized cyber practices. This ensures accuracy and repeatability needed for streamlined compliance. And I thought, not only that, it gives you your customers a chance to see that you're serious about CMMC compliance and that you're experiencing the same level of scrutiny that they are.
Right. No, it sounds great. Does anyone else have any thoughts on this? Just basically getting in and getting the cert and for yourself and for your clients?
Yeah, Bill, this is John. I really like what Jeff you said about operationalizing this capability through repeatability. And I think that's what's key to all of this, because, there's, even if we just treat this like a certificate, it's not going to be one and done. it has to be a continuous evolution of how we're treating and protecting, at the end of the day, the government's data. And that's what this is about. And that's what this has always been about. Not about self-attestation. And like you said, in the prior to CMMC days, when self-attestation was good enough, I remember being the program manager on another, in another life, with one of my subcontractors who said, "Yea, verily, sign the self-attestation." And then almost immediately thereafter sent me a document with CUI in it, but it wasn't, it wasn't encrypted. I was like, well, okay, great. And so operationalizing it is key.
Oh, absolutely. Any other thoughts, gentlemen?
Well, that's probably where you're starting to see a lot of the changes that I'd love to hear Nick's perspective on, is a lot of the changes in law that Congress has put into place for holding the primes responsible for the subs. And we're seeing a big change of people reaching out of, it's past the self-assessments now. It's getting really serious with the audits, and it's affecting people's bottom dollars of, will they be able to keep supporting the federal government?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's an interesting, just to mention on that, the law part is that there's, we had CFR 48 or the CUI 48 that came out November 10th. And there's already another one that's on the books for the entire federal contracting community. That's another 400 to 425,000 companies. And it's just waiting its notification date. So, and that's an interesting one because it steps back a little bit and doesn't require the C3PO in its first iteration, which is going to create that problem that we had again, which is what the certification process was designed to do. But it accounts for a difference in that it requires you to have now a data inventory. It requires you to know what CUI data you have, as part of your process. So I think we're seeing the laws start to catch up to themselves and start to create some parity. It's like, look, we're going to require everybody to certify. You're going to have to know your data footprint, in addition to what we have today. So the legal aspect of it, I think it's great that they're penalizing the living daylights out of companies. I know it's not the popular mantra to speak, but it's not like this came up last week and we just asked you guys to start doing this. This is a long process and everybody had input into it. It's just going to continue to get stricter. You'll see the standard of 171 R2 and R3, where R4 is sitting now today in its development. They're all moving back to 853. So we're just going to see it continually getting stricter. The laws are going to tighten up as well. So getting in at this early stage and quickly getting your hands around this helps you get your continual capabilities in place. And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges. I can get there. Okay, now what's next? How do I keep this? I got it running. Now, how do I A, control it? And then B, how do I keep it running so I stay within the guardrails of the framework?
That's great. Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's coming. Well, it's here, I guess. That's the thing to say. John, let's go to you and pull the thread a little bit more on one of your comments. Says, why does CMMC force integrators to rethink how they structure delivery, not just how they document controls?
Well, I see this is the key challenge to CMMC. And as Nick mentioned, this isn't something that the government just came up with today and said, all right, starting today, y'all are going to start doing this. These rules have been around for over a decade now. And I remember when the DFARS clause first started showing up in some of my contracts, and there was this gut, this gut reaction of, well, this is a systems level compliance thing. If we get our IT systems up to snuff, we're good to go. But I think what's important about what Nick had said is that you have to do a data inventory. You have to understand how you're dealing with your data, because your data are fundamentally how we are delivering operationally.
Yeah.
So it's not just about, I'm not going to say it's not about securing our systems. It is, but it's not just about that. We have to train our operations teams to think about how to protect the data in such a way that we are not only providing the infrastructure, the groundwork to protect that data, but when we are using those data, when we're processing it, when we're creating it, when we're transmitting it, that we're doing so with that in mind. So flowing down not just the awareness training of what CUI is, but how to deal with it operationally to the program teams is really critical, because that's how we make sure that we're meeting the spirit as well as the letter of the law.
Got it. Nick, you had a thought on that?
No, I couldn't agree more. I think that in the earlier stages, even years back when the standard really started to come into it's what we're seeing today in R2 and R3, with much better definitions and context around what things actually mean. There's more of an understanding that this is really a data problem. It's manifested in terms of the framework at a systems level, because that's where they started. There just wasn't a lot of the capabilities that we have today to deal with this at a data level. And I can assure you, data is very fungible. It's much easier to work with than immutable systems. And so that's a little bit of a culture shift for IT teams to say, well, let's kind of reset the framework of how we're dealing with this, from managing platforms and systems to what if we started fixing the data underneath that and understanding just how much of that we had and where it was and who had access to it. Now we're able to shrink how much of the system level stuff we need to manage and reduce a lot of the surface level that is ultimately results in a cost for me as either the integrator to be able to provide that service to the customer, or as the customer themselves is doing it on their own. So I had a complete agreement. I think that the landscape is, and you'll see this in R3, in later parts of R3 and R4, they're really going to start digging into the data side, and because they've got enough emphasis on the system level. And it's going to be it's always a good thing for the industry. I think it's also going to help reduce costs and shorten the time. The quicker you have control over your data environment and you can see exactly what you have, the less time you're going to have to spend finding the right systems that it should go on, the less cost you're going to have in storage, less cost you're going to have in new virtualization platforms and hardware if you decide to do a physical enclave. So it's a really quick way to reduce your short and longer term costs, and ultimately it's just going to be easier to manage a smaller environment.
Okay. Well, you led us right into our next question. I was going to ask you, Nick, where do integrators most often underestimate the cost and complexity of CMMC when bidding federal work?
I would not put the integrators out on an island by themselves, because we've all got the same problem. They just have it at scale, right? Mm-hmm. I would say it's math, and I know this is a strange way to put this. If you break down CMMC, it's really a set of mathematical equations, right? There's just math. There's time, there's labor, there's cost, there's complexity. And those things, if you work them the right way, you can start to get numbers that represent accurately. It's really the amount of time that goes into this, because I think in the traditional way that it's been done, it's hard, coming from, big four consulting firms and Accenture and the likes of those guys. That's what we make our money off of, is time, and how many resources we can attach to a certain amount of time. But CMMC has a lot of variables to it. There's a lot of complexity. You've got to manage, just to get started, you need a clean view of your data, your assets, and your users, and you need to have them in a view that you can see them all, and then start to take that up the layers till you get ultimately to where you can manage it. So I think that the time allocations is what is difficult, because customers are pushing speed. I need this yesterday. I got to do it fast. And therefore, the tools that you're using to do the scoping, and this is what ultimately is where they underestimate, is traditional tools today that they've been very comfortable with in the past. These aren't built for this. This is a different set of tooling that you really need to look at. And it's probably one of the biggest challenges, but the easiest to solve. Is you get the right tools to do this work, it's going to go a lot faster. You'll have much more accurate viewing. I think it's just the telescope that you're using to see the problem, which end of the telescope you're looking through is it's going to dramatically change how big that problem looks at the end of the day.
Oh, great stuff. Any other thoughts on the cost of CMMC that folks may or may not be planning for? All right. Sounds like we're ready for the next one. Let me go to Stretch. When integrators misunderstand or underestimate CMMC scope, what tends to break first from an operational standpoint?
It's funny. I was a system integrator for a very, very long time, but even on the vendor side, we're still susceptible to CMMC. in the eyes of the government, we're no different than an integrator or anywhere else. And one of the things I always found fascinating, this isn't necessarily the same for everyone that has the CMMC requirement, but I look at some of the big companies, like, John can attest to this, like GDIT and the Raytheons, who have a ton of federal contracts. And, and one of the things that I always like to say to these big integrators that are looking into this, if they have big contracts where they're providing compliance contract work to the government, they could probably leverage their own personnel with their compliance team for the overarching company. They probably have a lot of expertise on hand that could guide them through a little bit of what they should be looking for their auditors and their tool sets and everything else. And so, previous to here, I was the security manager of over at DARPA. And so, I used to deal with the compliance team there and all the RMF controls for the DoD and everything else. And this is no different than what the federal government's doing. It's just at a much smaller scale, but they're forcing it to happen in the commercial space. And it's just a matter of, how can you leverage some of the tools that you have and automate some of this versus having this very large consulting bill, when if you arm the consultants you're pulling in with the right tool sets, with like some of the folks that are on the call, you could really streamline getting this done in an effective way. Like, it doesn't have to be a complex. I mean, a lot of people panic and view it as a complex aspect, but if you get with the right partners, they can really help ease you through it.
John, you had a thought on that?
I did, yes, Stretch, since you kind of called me out there. You're absolutely, I agree with you completely.
I was GDIT for 10 years, so I have a very dear heart of GDIT.
Well, no, and it's funny because at a previous integrator prior to joining GDIT years ago, I started going down this path. I was actually leading our compliance effort during the earlier iterations of this prior to CMMC. And what you're suggesting is exactly what we did, right? I was brought in because of my expertise doing this kind of thing for clients and finding the most efficient mechanisms to use automated inventory, find out how we're using our data, how we're flowing that data, and then understanding where the choke points in our environment are to really focus on the big bang for the buck on where we need to invest to provide the most protection, and B, where are those vulnerable, missing scales in Smaug's armor that we're not thinking about as we're walking the data dog through the various workflow process. And that really requires someone with that operational expertise. But I'd like to kind of flip your comment on its side a bit to address one of the questions that came up in the chat, which was, would mandating these 3 PAO assessments had been more straightforward and met with less resistance early on. And I think the complexity of scale is one of the reasons why that might have, in my opinion, probably met with even more resistance, because it would have led at least to more confusion. Because with a mandate of a 3 PAO assessment, there's some implication that I'm going to have to pay, as an integrator, someone to do this work. And if the government is requiring it to me, then should I not charge that back to the government? And with a small company, it might be a little more straightforward how to do that. But with a company of the scale of GDIT, I mean, we have, how many contracts? You just name it, thousands if you're looking at individual task orders. Which one? How do I parse that chargeback back to the government? Or do I just wrap it into my rates? So there's this confusion of how would I have done that? And I think if they started with that early on, before we started the path of investment to comply, I think it would have caused I think personally it would have caused more consternation within the integrator community, because there would have been those questions.
Okay. John gets points for the Hobbit reference. Well done, sir. Nick, your thoughts?
I would just add on to what John said, in complete agreement that There's a ton of reasons why they did this. When 853 was out, you still had to have a 3PAO, right? And so there's always been some degree of a standardized assessment to it. And that was, I think, where the industry got ahead of the government too far with self-assessments. There was just, everybody would look at and this is partly to blame in the standard, not to blame, but there was just a lack of clarity of what the standard meant in terms of how I was assessing it. So you've got 100 companies and you've got 100 different ways that their 320, their objectives and controls are being assessed. And that was a problem, because there was always going to be some standard platform or some standard methodology that you had to be assessed. The only way that they could do that was to create the C3PO. But if you looked at 853, there's always been an assessment at any one of these. You don't get an exam and self-score and then get your college degree. I've never seen it happen. Sure, you could do it, but I've never seen it. So I think it was always anticipated. It was just put out of people's minds, because I think more of the problem of how we're going to deal with this from a time and cost perspective uniformly across, companies like GDIT and some of the large primes, you're talking thousands of suppliers across hundreds of contracts in multiple geographies, and on top of different regulations. I think the second thing, and this falls on the companies themselves, is there was quite honestly a lack of forthrighteousness about, hey, what our self-score really was. And when they went out and did audits, that precipitated the C3PLs, they found that 9 out of 10 were so far off that they were literally in a universe of themselves. There's just the impossibility index rose to a point where they simply the government said, all right, we've got to bring this down to earth. But to John's point, I do think that the government did not do a good job at all in subsidizing this industry. I think it was unfortunate that they just said, hey, here it is, you're the cost bearer. They should actually be putting these vouchers in place for the certifications that just start taking some of the load off. We went to Congress and put bills in front of Congress and worked for 2 months last year, with House and Armed Services committees, with DHS's, with the CISA subcommittees, saying, hey, you guys can't do this. This is ridiculous. So we put, $300 million in the budget to try to get this done. That is still circulating around Congress, and we're being kicked around like a football. And hopefully we'll see that land somewhere, and these committees can get it pushed out through the floor. But I agree.
What a lot of people aren't seeing either, Nick, and I'd be curious to see what others think about this, is there's what publicly shows up in news articles of, I think someone asked in the chat about, div companies have been doing self-attestation for quite some time. Do we think mandating this is going to be more straightforward? I think a lot of the mandating of this is what you don't see a lot of the news of, is how many companies that were self-reporting that were way off. And now we're starting to see publicly fines and not public fines behind closed doors, how often the government is fining all these organizations that said, I've met 300 controls, and they really met 10.
Yeah, there's a bucket load of, and this is not, it's just a perfect example. There are literally dozens and dozens and dozens of sealed indictments sitting up at DOJ right now, that the ones that you've seen today for the False Claims Act, these are just the ones that became public, or we're using a mild example of. But make no mistake about it, that group of enforcement and the cottage industries from the legal industry around that, this thing is just it's going to keep growing, because with regulations come new laws, and when new laws get broken, need new lawyers, and it just tumbles down the field. This is a quick way to get away from all that in doing this. Your compliance, understand the cost is not small, but the quickest way to start avoiding that risk, which anytime there's risk, there's a cost associated with it, is just it's here. There's nothing we can do to fix that. It's going to get more stringent, and so the earlier you can get yourself involved in this, the less costly and less painful it's going to be.
Bill, do you mind if I weigh in here? Because
Certainly.
I agree. Yeah, I agree, Nick, with what you said. And I would offer that this is an area where organizations, where companies who want to do better can really leverage, and this is where I think AI is going to be really important to help us, is, the thing about machine learning and the thing about AI is that while it does have some biases built into it that are that are based on the programmer. It also has the benefit of eliminating a lot of the context that we use in our own bias. And I suspect, try to be as rose-colored glasses, be an optimist here. I suspect that the vast majority of the DIB wants to do right. That's why we're in this industry. So if we accept that, then we look at these kinds of compliance efforts with a viewpoint of trying to do right, but then we also have these unstated assumptions of how we're operating our systems and how we're using our data. So we have some blind spots.
Yeah.
And I think this is a great opportunity to take advantage of the benefit of AI's lack of context to highlight some of those blind spots for us. And I was wondering if anyone had any thoughts on that.
I have a lot of thoughts on AI. We're an AI data firm that was built for CMMC. And I agree with you that trying to maximize the capabilities of AI, but you have to bound it to its context. And for CMMC, that has to be bound to evidence. And so this is really we have this rule in our company called the 95-5 rule that has served us well in the 5 years we've been building AI platforms, is if you go to AI with 5% of the knowledge and ask it for the other 95%, it's going to give you back very, very bad results that will not pass compliance. They will look great, but they will not pass an auditors. We have it the other way, where we go and ask AI for 5% to do what it's really good at, which is synthesizing, because we create bounded evidence in a data model that does that. There's no getting away from we just met a part of the government that they're uploading regular top secret documents into GPT, and there's no capability to stop them doing it. It's just unbelievable. But these are, companies are fixing that problem. You have to be able to use AI. There's no question about it. It's going to make the road a lot easier. The companies that we work with see this benefit of how we use it. But then you also have to harness it and constrain it, because companies don't want their data being used for training the AI models. So you need architectures that work and do these things, but you absolutely want to be able to leverage it in terms of how you can continuously maintain your environment. But the first step is, how can I use it to get me there? How can I use it to keep me there? And then and off you go. It's a different approach, but it's not. I would say this, as a cautionary rule, or just a way to think about this. AI is not a very good automation tool. It's really designed to be a thinking model. And you have to understand, prompting is how you get it to think about the problem. And then the better your prompting is, the better you're going to get results. They ran a very good test gave AI a prompt that it asked it for specifically, here's 1 million tasks exactly, simple tasks. And the results of that were like 65% it got right. Then they broke those 1 million tasks and entered in each one individually. And it was 99% accurate, because it was looking specifically at the problem and didn't infer this larger body or universe of knowledge. And that's where the CMMC has an issue, is you ask it for all of these things. It's looking at the entire universe of CMMC instead of just specifically to that objective, which is what you have to solve for. That's your denominator right there. Solve for the objective. That's not the framework, not the control. Solve for the objective. And if you can limit AI to think about that and bind it to the evidence, your use of AI will be exceptionally positive, and you're going to get a lot of bang for your dollar.
Well, that's awesome. And we're going to talk a lot about AI today, but you mentioned, Nick, getting the architecture right. So I want to go to Jeff to start talking about repeatability and scale for CMMC. So Jeff, what does a repeatable CMMC architecture actually look like for an integrator who's managing multiple customer environments?
Yeah, Bill, we talk a lot about this repeatability, standardization, and the ability to perform operational functions. We've talked a lot about that already today, but those, shouldn't really change from customer to customer. Things like FIPS 140-2, MFA, monitoring, patching, logging, inventory management. Obviously, we've talked a lot about that as well, but based on CMMC requirements, these are all items that need to stay consistent And, having standard platforms, processes, and procedures, and a solid, repeatable cyber practice in place are keys for CMMC repeatable architecture. And despite the rigidity required for supporting and maintaining a repeatable CMMC architecture, it is equally important to keep in mind that integrators need to maintain flexibility as an integrator, since customers have different CUI boundaries, hybrid environments, variety of tools, and the constant changing user end requirements. And I think we've talked a lot about inventory AI. So having Axonius and ComplAi in your hip pocket are great resources and tools to have when you're working on these repeatable efforts.
Sounds great. Yeah, audience member James that it said FIPS equals $, $. So none of this is cheap. I think we hear you, James. Thank you. We're getting great comments from our listeners, and we'll work those in as we already have some. There's another one or two, but great stuff. Any other thoughts on basically scaling this and building the architecture to keep CMMC going? If not, we'll roll right into it. John, can I ask you from a large integrator perspective, how do you balance standardized compliance architectures with the reality that each mission and customer environment has unique constraints?
See, I'm glad you asked that, because this has been my life for almost my entire career, working mostly for large integrators, balancing the various requirements of multiple programs. I think of this repeatability of the architecture that Jeff was talking about in terms of a yes and kind of scenario. Yes, we absolutely need to do that. And for each individual program, we need to define what additional, not fewer, but what additional data protections we need to provide in, whether it be for operational security. We just don't talk about Bruno, outside these walls, or whether it's something even more restrictive, for instance, specialized programs with special categories of CUI, like Navy nuclear propulsion information or law enforcement information or intel information, even though it's unclassified. So I think that repeatability that Jeff was describing is the absolute baseline that we need to have across the board, but then we need to empower the individual programs to take it a step further when warranted, but only when warranted. We don't want to go into this world of overclassification that I think we sometimes fall into that trap of.
Great stuff. Thank you. And I mean, you're throwing out the references. We're going to have a little quiz at the end to see all the references John mentioned, if folks can guess that one. Luckily, I have kids.
My students at George Washington know that I love to reference movies and speak in analogy. So
awesome. Well, it gets us there. Encanto, if I'm not mistaken, is the last one, but who knows? Luckily, my wife teaches children, and I know that. Let's talk to Nick a little bit about which parts of CMMC compliance break down first when integrators try to scale without automation or AI.
The tools, they are the primary, I would say, the factor that the interlock between tools and then the actual, just the tools themselves. It's a very different industry, and it's an emerging industry, right? It's been here for some time, but as from a commercial perspective, and companies now building platforms and solutions and tools and capabilities to actually solve these problems. The biggest thing is trying to repurpose old tools to do something that they really weren't designed to, and maybe only cover about 60%. That, well, it's close or good enough. That's great right up until a C3PL walks through the door, and then you find out just how not good enough it was, and then the problems just begin in earnest. So I think the first thing is the traditional tools used, and which tools you're using, and then how you are coupling those platforms or tools to create that continuous fabric of compliance. That's, I would say, probably because for the majority of the MSPs and integrators, these guys are longstanding businesses. They've been doing this a real, not without compliance frameworks. Don't get me wrong, but I think CMMC is a different breed, and it's difficult sometimes to try to take a very large platform that served 80% and try to apply it to this smaller group that you have that's 20%. That gap in like, oh, we can get away with it. It does, in instances it can work, but it further perpetuates the problem. So I think tools are one of the challenges, like this where, companies like Axonius really come in. It's purpose built for exactly these scenarios, right? And so trying to find those that really, and it'll reduce the cost. That's the other thing. Try to find something that's really narrowly tailored to build for CMMC. If that's the problem you're trying to solve, perfect. If you're trying to solve a larger enterprise problem, then find something that has a really good center of mass for CMMC and then has the additional capabilities that you're looking for, wherever asset data and users are concerned. And it's really, I think the last part of this is it's just fundamental for IT teams to think in terms of systems and networks and really immutable context of things, physical assets or digital, cloud assets. It's and as a result of that, it doesn't allow you to leverage the processes. I'm not saying it's a clean slate when you start to CMMC, but you kind of have to set your rules and processes aside and then go through the journey and add those back in. Just as John was saying, it's an and. So it's this and it's also what we had built here. It's this and this. So instead of just trying to framework and then shapeshift a framework onto that, start to build a separate one. Say, well, this is just a better tool. You'll find out that there's with the right, you can do so much with two small hammers than you could do with two small screwdrivers. It's really all about the tools you select. And for customers, this is a great chance for you to go to your integrators and say, hey, can you use these tools? Because they're trying to do things at scale. And if it works for a good group of companies, they'll roll that across because it's good for them. Labor is one of our biggest foes, and this is the people cost. Integrators, that's just all of us that even build these tools. It's how much expertise do we have available to solve that problem? So, and labor comes at a high cost in this industry. It did not start out at the $95 an hour rate. These experts are expensive. So I think that's one of the scaling plateaus is on the labor. And so solving for that, the only way to really do that is through accelerators, but you have to find tools that are really purpose built. And that's where I think companies are running around searching the daylights out of Google, trying to attend as many events to really get a feel for what's the right fit for me.
Got it. We hear this a lot. How does what you're describing differ from traditional governance, risk, and compliance tools?
Dramatically. It's funny, and it's a great question and an accidental parlay. When we originally and I'll give an example of our company because this was something we struggled with. When we first came out, all of us came out of governance or risk and compliance firms, audit firms, and so it was our nature to leverage what was there, what we knew as usable. We had familiarity with it. But when we started ComplAi, we recognized that, man, it's just such a bad fit, the amount of re-engineering that we had to do. And GRCs weren't built for this. What we see today is you have a GRC and then CMMC came along. They said, oh, we'll just add another model onto there, not add another capability, and they bolted it onto a GRC. But originally you had a data model that was not fundamentally written for CMMC. And as a result of that, it doesn't necessarily work as well as it could. Then you had AI come along. So so we had a GRC, then we bolted on CMMC, then we bolted on AI. But none of that were fundamentally part of how the platform was actually designed to be run. And so that's where GRCs really fall down, is in the manualness of it. Even though it seems like it has automation, we stepped away from that and said, look, it's really hard to assign risk to CMMC. And that's what a GRC is supposed to be good at. It's really, there's three things. It's not a governance, risk, and compliance issue in CMMC. It's a continuous governance and assurance, what you want trying to solve for. And that's where we looked at, okay, we're structurally in a category of GRCs, but we couldn't subscribe to the way of doing it because it just created too many impediments to the company successfully getting through the process. And as John was saying, we have a totally ulterior motive for why we're in this business. We had more of an objective of fixing this problem that annoyed us so much, and the implications on this. You know, in Florida, we're the fourth largest state that receives federal money in the DIB, and this has a 14% impact on our GDP. These are cafes closing, schools closing. This has a massive impact. And just looking around my community, we were like, oh man, we got to kind of help fix this. So there was more of an impotence on us to try to solve the problem at scale for companies versus, hey, we're going to run out and throw some junk together and call it CMMC worthy and make a profit on it. We just simply refuse to do that. But I think GRCs are good in a context. Some of them will fit for some size companies, but I think you'll see an evolution over the next year, this year, next year, of a resetting of GRCs are not really the right tool for here. It'd be like taking a framing hammer to, a picture framing hammer to go build a house with. Are you going to get there? Probably, maybe, who knows? Instead of really getting the right tool that's going to help you get through that faster and quicker and build a better product, build a better house.
Oh, great. A huge subtopic here. Any other thoughts, guys? Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, there's something I'm curious to talk to. One of the things I'm really curious to talk to the rest of the team about is there was something that Nick mentioned when he talked about risk. And I'd be really curious as some of Jeff's insights, what he's seen in the past, and same for John. I saw something in the chat where people were talking about or asking the question, can we explain using AI large language models supposed to conform with the code of professional conduct for CMMC? And, let's just take AI out of it for a second. Generically, when you purchase any tool for your organization, the people that are on the call, you may or may not be ones responsible for doing the risk assessment, but you might be the ones looking for tools, and then whoever your team is doing the risk assessment when you bring that tool in. Is it hosted by the vendor? How does the vendor protect your data? It's going to be the same thing for AIs and LLMs. If you were looking at a solution that we're all talking about here today, especially talking about how ComplAi connects to a lot of the tools to automate some of the aspect of it, you're still going to evaluate the vendor to see how their large language model protects your data versus, is that vendor using a public large language model, therefore your data is not secure, and then it's going out and training public models. So that doesn't change any from just a regular tool versus an AI LLM. And, the AIs, this is just the way that Nick was talking about it and the way that we have used it within Axonius and others. It's to help the user automate and speed up some manual processes. The biggest thing with asset management within the industry that I'm in is, believe it or not, people are still using Microsoft Excel and they're data dumping CSVs, all the different assets, and manually deduping it. That's no different than the compliance world. So much is being done in Excel, and they're passing these Excel sheets back and forth. And that's where the large labor costs come into play. And then what we're talking about today is trying to reduce that to get your labor costs down, where you're maximizing the full use of those FTEs, not to be doing a bunch of manual labor that you're paying a lot of money for. One of the things in the industry that I find kind of interesting, when you use a law firm, the law firms are using, whatever the legal assistants are that maybe don't bill as much to do a lot of the busy work. And then your high billing comes from, the lawyer's expertise, and you want to limit how much as is happening. You don't see it that much in the audit world. You're getting billed at a high rate across the board. So if you can utilize the tools to help you get the most bang for your buck, and then so when you do have that FTE that's doing some of the manual auditing, you're getting a lot further. John and John, I'd be curious about some of your take on that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think, this is where what Nick was talking about, the various tools, are you going to use a small household hammer to try to frame out a house? One thing I know living on a farm is every tool is a hammer, but there are some times when the right tool is the only tool for the job. And I think what you're describing, Stretch, is exactly it. You want to make sure that you're using AI to maximize some of those capabilities where they make sense, and particularly in the case of using not necessarily large language models, but what I have come to refer to as small language models. The actual term of art is the retrieval augmented generation model, the RAG type approaches. But I think that's where it becomes, you get those specialized smaller language models to really help hone in on those capabilities. And I don't know, Nick or Jeff, if you want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, I get involved pretty heavily here at Red River with, organizations that are going through this, and, the ways that they want to collect their data and things like that, and, offering services that have this GRC. But, obviously, I think for us being able to dip into Active Directory and, things like that to grab GPO settings, or there's a big chunk of these controls and objectives that you can automate and really just provide that, the up-to-date, less work to do. I mean, obviously you got to do it up front, right? But once you say, hey, go get me this data on an X amount of basis, and throwing that into the GRC tool, or however that transitions down the road, is one of the key things that we're seeing from our standpoint, and really teaching other organizations to utilize the tools that they do have to ensure that they're not getting overwhelmed.
If it's okay, I'll just real quick to answer this question on
Sure.
About explaining how using AI and the LLM is supposed to conform with CMMC and the Code of Professional Conduct. Here's the quick 1-minute view. Right now, unless you're using one of the two versions of either OpenAI that's in Azure GCC High, or you're using the version that's sitting, the Bedrock version that's sitting in AWS GovCloud, you're pretty much in violation. This has been a debate that we've gone through with, I can't even tell you how many C3POs that we worked with to build our platform. We built one of it from the assessor view, so the C3POs use our platform to actually perform the assessments. The other side of it is how companies engage with it, and in the middle sits our capabilities for the platform. The reason being is there were architectural constraints put into those two AI LLMs that specifically conform to not allowing the training use of the model. SSPs are considered to be your will have CUI in them. So will your policies to some extent. So if you're asking AI to determine configurations per specific objective based on the evidence systems being, let's say, Okta and Active Directory, and you're putting that in there, technically that's CUI data. That's just how the assessors view it. Do I think it's that way? No. But is that how they see it? And that's all that matters at the end of the day. It's how they view it. They run the table on the game. And so it's everything that you do has to be based on that. We just found a capability now that can prevent ChatGPT and from any of whether it's Gemini, prevent you from accidentally putting CUI data in there. Really cool. Saw this technology this morning on a call with one of our partners. I was like, wow, that's amazing. It would prevent a lot of the problems to constrain you or remove the CUI data before you submit it into an LLM, which is great. That then allows you to use the public models. The public models they're a couple of versions ahead of what you have in the cloud. So this is where the AI engineering tries to close that gap, and it's not the most elegant solution sometimes, but to maintain the Code of Professional Conduct, it's really what you're putting into the LLM that is going to determine whether or not you're actually putting CUI into it. I would say like 9 out of 10 times that we've seen customers in the use cases they presented on how they're using AI would create a violation for you in terms of pushing CUI data out of your organization into it. And if it doesn't do that, the next biggest problem that it should be a concern for you is my data being used to train an AI model? And the answer is absolutely. You bet 100%. So it's just this responsible use. You've got to get a hold of what you're putting into AI and how you're doing it, and then squeeze it down. You focus on harnessing the capabilities, binding everything to evidence, but also keeping that into these models at work.
Got it. Stretch or John, you want to add to that, kind of close the loop? Well, let's Let's roll on this. Stretch, I got another question for you. How do integrators avoid reinventing compliance for every new customer while still accounting for environment specific differences?
Bill, you're trying to give me all the hard questions today, I see.
And we took a vote earlier.
You know, it's interesting. A lot of times they don't have to necessarily reinvent compliance for a new customer. I mean, they are trying to work on compliance for their core organization. You know, so the way that they're flowing down these standards is why we're seeing a bunch of changes. Is my assumption is really the DIB is giving a bunch of feedback back to the government. You know, and so they're really trying to make it's kind of no different than organizations doing SOC 2. You know, they have to do SOC 2 compliance because they want to do business to business transaction, or they have a need because they're publicly traded or what have you. You know, it's just another framework. So CMMC is just more focused on the federal framework of something that's similar. If you've done SOC 2, you could do a crosswalk of the controls and then figure out what you're missing and then plug those gaps. And if you can do that across the board, that should work for all federal customers that you're going to have going forward. It shouldn't be a unique requirement from contract to contract. I think what you're going to start seeing the trend of, though, is all the contracts should have similar verbiage from the FAR that are going to start saying you must have CMMC. You know, and that should be consistent across the board. It's just how well is the company going to panic of making sure that they have it? Because I've been at some conferences with Nick and others where after the conference we did some speaking like we are here, and there were some people, they had no idea that they had this requirement. You know, they thought it was all taken care of, and they go and start asking the company. They said, "Yeah, nobody's working on this." So it's eye-opening.
Any thoughts there, gentlemen? No. We're getting close. I have to tell you, we could have done 90 minutes easily today because there's a number of topics we're not going to get to, and some great questions from the audience. But folks, we'll get those questions answered for you, and the FedInsider folks will get those back out to our audience members. Any thoughts on reinventing compliance?
Yeah, Bill, if you don't mind, I think what Stretch said makes a lot of sense in that it's once you establish a compliance framework, the specific compliance model applies, whether it's CMMC, SOC 2, you can even go to other maturity model type frameworks like even CMMI. Because once you've established that sense of following process and recognizing that you have documents to which you must demonstrate evidence of compliance, that's where it really, the rubber really hits the road. And again, I want to reiterate, I think this is where AI can help us identify those tail ends on the 5% that I think Nick was talking about. You know, that part that we may be missing because, well, nobody in their right mind would ever store passwords in an Excel spreadsheet that's left unencrypted. You know, who would do that? But
I've never seen that in my career, John.
Never happens, right? But an AI model can help us ask those questions of our own environment and say, show me the evidence that you are doing this, or show me the evidence that you are not. And it makes us take that hard look at ourselves of, well, of course oh, wait, am I really? And makes us stop to think. And I think that's where that can help us do that without having to reinvent the wheel every time.
Yeah. Nick, you had a thought, sir?
I was just going to say that there's, as we look forward to what's, one of the outcomes and I get this question quite a lot, just even during regular customer conversations. What are you seeing? What's next? We're looking at using these things. How, what's coming that is going to be impacted by the standards of the framework? Here's two things you can guarantee that's happening. One of them I know for a fact because we help write the standard for NIST. There's a data control family that's coming out, right? This will be an R3. You will see a replica of what's in the law right now, or what's in the code, the proposed code for the federal contracting community, which is called the FAR CUI. That requires a data inventory, and you will see this coming out in one version in R3, but before R4 comes out. So if you get a hold of that now, you'll be in much better shape. The second thing is you will see a control family come out for AI. They're already working on this. That's guaranteed. They've got to have some regulation and control usage around that. That's absolutely, you can expect the AI wouldn't get here until 27. So about a year, a little more than a year. The data protection control family, that you will see this year, no doubt about it. And the third thing I would say for your AI design, don't rethink about how you're using it. We don't build AI in tools. We got away from that in our first 6 months of building this, and we were building back when GPT was version 2. So there's a long way. This is like with sticks and stones and caveman days. Build it in terms of personas. So think about what a person would want to do, not a tool, because you're trying to replace what a person would do, not necessarily how to glom tools together or create that. So when we build products for our platform, we think about it from a security architect, a cloud architect, a solution architect, a compliance architect. And we build a persona, and then we put them on a production line and say, this person does this, then Bob does this, then Jerry does this, and so forth. So rethink the way that you're using it, because that'll save you a lot of time in trying to strap together MCP servers and effective use of agentics, things like that. And you'll find that you can get much better results from AI using a persona-based viewpoint, as opposed to, let me just slam a bunch of agents together and crack on an MCP server, a few of those, and grab some N8N and off I go. Simplify the process in your costs, and you get a much better result from AI.
Awesome. Well, guys, we're almost out of time, so I'll ask you just for like a 30-second recap. Jeff, any final thoughts or advice for folks out there in the FSI community, what they need to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it's going to come down to, hey, like we mentioned earlier, that operationalization. You have to be able to produce artifacts, not flounder a lot during assessment. Make sure you really have your, I guess, your key personnel, the ones that are the most versed in the environments that you're reviewing. Go through mock assessments. And ultimately, at the end of the day, just make sure that you're able to go through, pull up artifacts, everything, just in a very timely manner, because that'll show the maturity of your cyber, efforts to C3PAO.
Great. Gentlemen, probably 30 seconds each. Any final thoughts?
Start with your data. I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
No, please.
Start with your data. We've been doing this for a while now, and I think you'll find agreement in the community. If you're going to simplify, the first step that we go through with the customer is we find your data. That is your grounding point. So if you're just getting started in your CMMC journey, go find your data, get a really good, a decent tool, a DSPM. There's so many good ones out there. I have a handful of them. If you need guidance on which one to use, reach out to us here at ComplAi. But find your data first. Don't start there, because everything else gets smaller from that point. If you start the other way, everything funnels out. And if you don't find your data, you'll always be chasing what your boundary is going to be.
Thanks, Nick. And thanks, John and Jeff and Stretch. That has to be our last word for today. Awesome. We could have gone so much further. Let me turn it back over to John Hosky. Thanks again for a great conversation. John?
Absolutely. Thank you, Bill, for hosting. Great job as always. And gentlemen, thank you for your participation. Very interesting and informative. For the audience, thank you as well for being here. Training certificates will be emailed after the webinar ends. Remember to log back in the next day or two. If you do need a copy of that captioning transcript, it'll be in the resources section. And we do have very many webinars and events in the works. So be sure to visit FEDINSIDER.com to see what's coming up and to register for multiple events at once. And while you're there, check out our podcast, Feds at the Edge. And with that, this is FedInsider signing off.